When I was around 6 or 7, my mom remarried a man named Nick. At first, I thought it was a good thing, hoping that having another adult in the house might make things feel more complete. I was wrong, though. Nick didn't just bring himself into our lives. He also had a son named Ben, who was 6 years older than me. From the moment they moved in, I felt invisible. I remember the day they officially settled in. My mom was all smiles, helping Nick and Ben set up their rooms and decorating the walls with family pictures. But when I looked at those photos later, it was all pictures of them. Mom, Nick, and Ben. Not a single one of me. It felt odd, as if I wasn't even part of the family. As time passed, things became clearer. Mom began treating Ben like he was the center of her world. She'd make his favorite meals, help him with his homework, and attend his soccer games, while I was left home alone. I'd ask if I could join them, but she would make excuses, saying it was just for Ben or that he was having a special day. It felt as if no matter what I did, I was just an extra. Ben wasn't any help either. He made sure I knew I wasn't welcome. He'd walk by my room and say things like, "No one really wants you here." And if I ever told Mom or Nick, they would just brush it off, saying, "He's just being a boy." Or worse, they would tell me to be the bigger person and show Ben respect because he was my older brother. They wanted me to respect someone who was making my life miserable. I tried to ignore it, but it wasn't easy. Ben had this way of making every day feel tense. He'd take my things and hide them, or worse, break them. When I confronted him, he'd just laugh and say it was an accident. One time, he destroyed my favorite dollhouse, a gift from my dad before he left. I remember crying while trying to glue the pieces back together, with Ben just watching and smirking. When I showed Mom, hoping she'd be upset, she just shrugged and told me, "Maybe you shouldn't leave your things where they can get ruined." What kind of response was that? Speaking of my dad, things got even more twisted. My mom always spoke of him like he was a monster. Now, I'm not saying he was perfect. He drank a lot and cheated on her. But to her, he was the villain. And somehow, I became guilty by association. I remember one time when I was about 10, I was arguing with Ben because he was hogging the TV like he always did. Mom walked in and, instead of stopping him, looked at me with a cold expression and said, "You're acting just like your father." That one hurt. It wasn't like I chose to look like him, but every time she looked at me, it felt like she was seeing him instead. No matter what I did, I could get straight A's, keep my room spotless, and help around the house, but she always found a way to compare me to him. And it was never positive. The more I think about it, the clearer it becomes that Mom only had energy for Ben. I'd come home from school, and the house would smell like freshly baked cookies, but they weren't for me. I'd find Ben in the kitchen, eating an entire batch Mom had made just for him. When I asked if I could have some, she'd say, "These are for Ben. He needs them for soccer." I wasn't even allowed one. And then there were times when Mom and Nick would take Ben on special outings, amusement parks, movies, even weekend trips. I remember standing at the doorway, watching them pack up the car. I'd ask if I could come too, and Mom would give me a half-hearted smile and say, "Maybe next time, sweetie, this one's just for Ben." But that next time never came. I spent many weekends alone, feeling like I was invisible in my own life. The only time I felt like I mattered was when I was with my grandparents, my dad's parents. They were the only ones who made me feel seen. They would pick me up on weekends and take me to their house, where we'd bake cookies, and I could eat as many as I wanted. They never treated me like a problem. I would tell them about my life at home, how Ben would bully me, and how Mom seemed to forget I existed. My grandpa would listen quietly, his face serious. Then he'd say, "You're nothing like your father. You're your own person." and you're better than all of this. Those weekends were like a breath of fresh air, where I could pretend I wasn't the unwanted stepchild, just a regular kid who had people who loved me. But coming back home was always a harsh reminder of reality. When I walked through the door, it felt like the air turned cold. I could feel the resentment from my mom, and Ben would always be there, ready to start things again. It became a never-ending cycle. Looking back, I see the pattern. My mom made a choice. She chose Nick. She chose Ben. And she chose to leave me out. It wasn't just favoritism, it was neglect. I was a reminder of a past she hated, and instead of dealing with that, she took it out on me. Ben, on the other hand, thrived in that environment. He knew he was the golden child, and he used it. He'd find ways to make me feel small, whether it was taking my things or spreading rumors about me at school. The few times I tried to stand up for myself, I was punished. Once, after he called me worthless, I yelled at him, and Mom grounded me for a week, telling me to respect him because he'd been through a lot. I remember thinking, what about me? Haven't I been through a lot too? But no one ever asked how I felt. No one cared that I felt like an outsider in my own home. It was always about making sure Ben was happy and safe, while I had to fend for myself. It felt like they were lifting him up and pushing me down. Even now, all these years later, it's hard to shake the feeling that I was never good enough for them. Back then, all I wanted was a little bit of the love and attention Ben got. After high school, I knew I had to get out of that house. I had been counting down the days until graduation, seeing it as my ticket to freedom. The only thing that kept me sane during those years was knowing that eventually I could leave and start fresh somewhere far away from the chaos at home. I wouldn't have been able to do it without my grandparents. They were my lifeline. When senior year came around, my grandparents told me they'd help me get through college. I'll never forget the day they told me. I was sitting at their kitchen table, talking about how stressed I was about my future, especially because I didn't know if Mom would help with my college expenses. She never talked to me about it. And all I knew was that Ben was getting everything handed to him. A new car, college tuition, you name it. My grandpa looked at me and said, "We're going to help you, kid. You deserve a chance at a good life." Just like that, they offered to pay for my tuition. It felt like a huge weight was lifted. My mom barely even spoke to me about college, but my grandparents were there for me without hesitation. The moment I got accepted into college, I knew there was no turning back. I moved in with my grandparents, and for the first time in my life, I felt safe. It was the first time I wasn't walking on eggshells. Their house was small and simple, but it felt like home. They actually cared about my day, cooked with me, and showed genuine interest in my life. For the first time, I felt like I was seen for who I really was, not just as a reminder of past mistakes. I focused on my studies and worked hard to make my grandparents proud. On the other hand, my mom barely called. The only time I'd hear from her was when she needed something or wanted to brag about Ben. She'd say things like, "Ben got into this amazing business program," or "Ben's doing so well, you should take notes." It was like she had to remind me how successful he was. It stung, but I had gotten good at pretending I didn't care. Nick wasn't any better. When he showed up at family events, he would talk endlessly about how proud he was of Ben, never once asking how I was doing or what I was studying. It was as if I was just the kid they had to tolerate until I was out of their lives. After I left, it felt incredible, but there was something strange about it. Even though I had finally escaped that toxic environment, the effects were still with me. I'd often catch myself wondering if my mom ever thought about me, or if she'd ever reach out just to check if I was okay. She didn't. Most of the time, it was complete silence. When she did contact me, it always felt more like a formality than genuine concern. I stayed busy with classes, work, and meeting new people. I joined a few campus clubs, went out now and then, and for the first time, it felt like I was actually starting to build my own life. But each time my phone buzzed with a message or notification from my mom, that familiar knot in my stomach would return, like I was bracing for something unpleasant. Her messages were usually just asking for a quick update, always in a cold, detached tone. It was clear she was simply going through the motions. One day during my second year, she called me unexpectedly. It was strange because she only called when she needed something. I hesitated but answered anyway. The conversation was awkward from the start. She tried to make small talk about my classes and friends, but it felt forced. Then she got to the point. She needed money. I was taken aback. I was a college student, barely managing to cover my books and rent, and she knew that. But apparently, Ben had messed up. She didn't go into details, just that he needed help and wondered if I could contribute. I was stunned. She had no hesitation in asking me, her daughter, whom she had practically ignored for years, to help her precious Ben. I told her flatly, "Mom, I don't have money to spare. I'm barely getting by myself." She sighed this exaggerated, drawn-out sigh and said, "Well, I thought you'd be more responsible now that you're living on your own." I sat there, speechless, feeling all the years of being made to feel inadequate rushing back. Now, she was making me feel guilty for not helping Ben, the son she always favored. After that call, I promised myself that I'd focus on my own life and stop trying to earn her approval. It was clear that no matter what I did, it would never be enough. So, I threw myself into my studies, worked part-time, and saved up as much as I could. The less I communicated with her, the better I felt. Time passed, and by the time graduation rolled around, things were looking up. I had a job lined up, and my grandparents were so proud of me. They attended my graduation, cheering for me like I was the only one there. But guess who wasn't there? My mom, Nick, and Ben. I shouldn't have been surprised, but it still stung. They showed up for every one of Ben's events, but when it came to me, it was like I didn't matter. After the ceremony, my grandparents took me out to dinner, and we celebrated my accomplishment. It was one of the happiest moments of my life, and for a little while, I managed to forget about my mom and the mess of my past. I was just proud of myself for making it through everything. After graduation, my grandparents offered for me to stay with them while I got settled. I was thankful, but I also wanted to have my own place eventually. I started working full-time and saving up. My grandparents were always there, supporting me, making sure I had everything I needed. I couldn't have asked for better people in my life. But then, about a year into my job, everything changed. My grandpa fell seriously ill. It happened so fast. One minute, he was fine, and the next, he was in the hospital. My grandma tried to stay strong, but I could see how hard it was for her. I tried to be there for both of them, but losing him was the hardest thing I'd ever gone through. It felt like I had lost a part of myself. A few months later, my grandma passed away as well. It was like losing the only two people who had ever truly cared about me. The house was so quiet and empty without them. But they had left everything to me. Their home, their savings, everything. It was overwhelming. I was grateful, but at the same time, all I wanted was to have them back. I moved into their house, and at first it felt strange, like I was living in a memory. But I made it my own. I painted the walls, redecorated, and turned it into a place that felt like mine. It was bittersweet, but I knew they'd be happy to see me building a life for myself. Living there alone gave me time to think. I finally had space, both physically and emotionally, to figure out who I was without my mom's shadow hanging over me. I still kept in touch with her, but it was distant. I felt obligated, not because I wanted to. As much as I loved my grandparents and everything they did for me, the absence of my mom's support still lingered in the back of my mind, even if I tried not to let it bother me. After living in my grandparents' house for a couple of years and settling into my new life, I finally reached a point where things felt stable. I had my routine, work, hobbies, hanging out with a few friends, and honestly, it felt good. No drama, no family chaos, just peace. But then, out of nowhere, Ben reappeared in my life. One day, I received a message request on social media from him. I hadn't heard from him in almost 2 years. We'd pretty much stopped talking after I moved in with my grandparents. I assumed we had moved on with our separate lives, so seeing his name on my screen threw me off. I stared at the notification, debating whether to even open it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked on it. It was a long message from him, starting with the usual small talk, asking how I was and saying he hoped I was doing well. But it didn't take long for him to get to the point. He and his family were being evicted. He mentioned how their landlord was kicking them out, and how they couldn't find another place to live because no one would rent to them. He didn't give many details, just that it was bad enough that no one wanted them. He said they had found a place in a questionable area, but didn't feel comfortable moving there, especially with his daughter, Adeline, who was about 4 or 5. He went on about how unsafe it was, and how he was trying to do what was best for her. Then came the big request. He asked if they could stay with me for a while until they got back on their feet. Honestly, my first reaction was pure confusion. Why me? We hadn't talked much as kids, and the few times we did, it was because he bullied me. We weren't exactly close. Since we became adults, he had never reached out unless he needed something. Now, suddenly, he was pulling the "we're family" card. It felt strange. I sat there, staring at the message, trying to figure out why he was contacting me. Part of me felt bad for him, but another part was irritated. It was like he was acting as if all the years of him treating me poorly didn't matter. And then the way he phrased it. He acted like he was doing me a favor by offering to help with rent while staying at my place. But if he was being evicted, how much could he really contribute? I didn't reply right away. I needed time to think about it. I told myself that maybe he had changed, but the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. It didn't sit right with me that he was only reaching out when he needed something, so I let the message sit there for a few days. A few days later, he messaged me again, this time with more urgency. He said their situation was getting worse and that they had no options left. He emphasized how scared his daughter was and how they were running out of time. He mentioned that my house was perfect for them because of the extra bedrooms and big backyard, which would be great for Adeline. He even tried to sweeten the deal by saying they'd stay out of my way because of our different work schedules. Finally, I decided to respond. I started by saying that I was sorry he was going through all of this, but that I wasn't. I told Ben that I wasn't comfortable with the idea of him and his family moving in. I explained that, given our history and how he had treated me, it just didn't feel right. I tried to be as polite as possible, but I wanted to be truthful. Ben immediately responded, and he doubled down on his argument. He said, "That was years ago. We were just kids. You're really going to hold that against me now?" He went on about how I needed to move on from the past and how it wasn't about us, but about his daughter, Adeline, who was innocent in all of this. I could feel my frustration rising as it seemed like he was twisting things to make me feel guilty, like I was the bad guy for not offering my home to him. The constant mention of his daughter felt like manipulation. I understood that no child should be punished for their parents' mistakes, but was it really my responsibility? I told him again that I wasn't comfortable and that my decision was final. That's when he shifted from trying to guilt-trip me to accusing me of being heartless. He wrote, I thought you had changed, but clearly you're just as selfish as when we were kids." He even went as far as to say I was acting just like my father. That stung because I knew exactly how my mom used to use that line against me. I didn't respond. I blocked him, but that didn't stop the messages. A few days later, I began receiving texts from family members I hadn't heard from in a long time. Somehow, Ben had managed to get them all on his side, and they were bombarding me with the same message. "Think about Adeline." It was like a broken record. My aunt texted saying, "I know you've had issues with Ben, but Adeline shouldn't suffer for it." An older cousin messaged me on Facebook, saying the same thing. It felt like everyone was trying to guilt me into changing my mind, acting like I was the villain for not opening my home to family. Yet, none of these people had been there when I needed them. None of them cared when I felt abandoned. The pressure was starting to get to me. I began to second-guess myself, wondering if maybe I was being too harsh. But then I reminded myself that Ben had never once apologized for how he treated me as a child. Not even once. The fact that he couldn't even acknowledge it now, as an adult, only confirmed that he hadn't changed. The final straw came when my mom called. She rarely reached out unless something big was happening, so I knew she'd side with Ben. She didn't waste time and got straight to the point. She asked why I was refusing to help my brother. I tried to explain how Ben had always been cruel to me and never took responsibility, but she cut me off. She said, "Ben's my son, and I have to prioritize him and his family." It felt like a slap in the face. All those years of feeling like I wasn't good enough. And now, even as an adult, she was still doing it. She referred to Ben as her son, but spoke about me as if I was some distant relative. A wave of anger and sadness washed over me, but mostly I felt disappointment. I hung up, realizing that no matter what I did, my mom would never see me as her priority. It would always be about Ben. I stood my ground and told myself I wasn't going to let him move in, no matter how hard they tried to guilt me. I knew it would only end poorly for me if I gave in. It felt empowering to finally say no and stick to it. But I'd be lying if I said it didn't mess with my head. It's hard to shake the feeling of being the bad guy, especially when everyone around you is telling you that you are. After I told Ben no and blocked him, I hoped things would calm down, but it was only the beginning of the fallout. It seemed that Ben wasn't done trying to get what he wanted. He must have told everyone in the family about our conversation, and of course he painted himself as the victim. Suddenly, I was bombarded with messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. It was shocking how people who hadn't spoken to me in so long were suddenly up in my business, expressing their disappointment in me. My phone kept lighting up with messages like, "How could you turn your back on family?" Or, "Adeline is an innocent child." They made it seem like I was heartless for not wanting to open my home to someone who had bullied me for years. It was as if everyone had forgotten how Ben treated me growing up. One cousin, who I hadn't heard from in forever, sent me a long message on Facebook about how I needed to rise above the past and be the bigger person. It felt like they all had the same script. I was livid, but I ignored most of it. There was no point in responding. These people didn't know what I had been through as a kid. They only saw the version of Ben that he wanted them to see, the one who always played the nice guy when it suited him. Then, one day, I got a knock on my door. It was my mom. I hadn't seen her in months, and honestly, I wasn't expecting a visit. She showed up looking stressed and exhausted, as if she had the weight of the world on her shoulders. I was tempted to not answer, but I knew she wouldn't stop knocking, so I let her in. Without wasting any time, she sat down and started lecturing me about being selfish, how Ben was struggling, and how, as a sister, I needed to help. I tried to stay calm, but it was hard. I told her, "Mom, he treated me like garbage for years, never even apologized, and now you expect me to just let him move in like nothing happened?" She sighed, acting like she was tired of the conversation already, and said, "People change. He's different now. He's a father, and he's trying his best." Then she pulled the classic line, "You of all people should understand what it's like to struggle." That hit a nerve because she knew exactly how much I struggled, and yet she did nothing to help me when I was a child. My hands were shaking as I tried to keep my emotions in check. I told her flat out, "Ben has never taken responsibility for anything he's done. He hasn't apologized or even acknowledged how he treated me, and you and Nick just let it happen." She gave me that disappointed look, the same one she used to give me when I was a child. "You need to move on. Holding on to grudges won't help anyone, especially not Adeline," she said. I felt like I was hitting a wall. It was the same argument over and over. Blame me for not letting go of the past, but no one ever told Ben to take responsibility. I asked her why Ben couldn't stay with her and Nick, but she got defensive. "Well, you know we don't have the space, and Nick's health hasn't been good lately." It was just excuse after excuse. She started getting emotional, talking about how Adeline was suffering and how it broke her heart to see her granddaughter in such a situation. I could tell she was trying to manipulate me, and for a second, I almost gave in. But then I remembered all the times she ignored me when I needed her most, all the times she sided with Ben even when he was wrong, and it hit me. I wasn't going to be manipulated into fixing their mess. Not this time. I stood up and told her, "I'm sorry, but my answer is still no. I'm not going to let them move in." She stared at me for a moment, then muttered, "I expected better from you." That hurt more than I thought it would. I was so used to her disappointment, but hearing her say it like that felt like a punch in the gut. I remained firm and told her she had to leave. She grabbed her purse, and as she walked out, she muttered about how ungrateful I was. I closed the door behind her and felt a mixture of anger and relief. For once, I had stood my ground, but at the same time, there was this heaviness, like I had done something wrong. In the days that followed, the texts and messages from family members kept coming, and in fact, they got worse. It felt like they were all teaming up to make me feel guilty. Some even started posting vague messages on Facebook about family abandoning family, and how some people were too proud to remember their roots. It wasn't hard to figure out who they were talking about. One of my aunts, who I hadn't heard from since my grandparents' funeral, even left me a long voicemail about how I needed to forgive and forget, because family is all we've got. She went on and on about how Ben was struggling, and how it was up to me to do the right thing. But none of these people reached out to me when I was struggling, when I was a child, when my grandparents passed, or when I was trying to get through college. It was always about Ben. Eventually, I had to block some of them because it was becoming harassment. They wouldn't accept no for an answer, and I was done explaining myself. I knew I didn't owe them an explanation, but it still got to me. It's tough not to feel guilty when everyone around you is telling you you're the problem. Then one day, while shopping at the grocery store, I ran into an old high school friend. As we caught up, she asked how things were going with my family. I shared the whole story, not really expecting much of a response from her, but she surprised me. She looked me right in the eye and said, "Good for you. You don't owe them anything, especially after everything they put you through." She reminded me of all the times she had witnessed Ben bullying me, and how my mom did nothing to stop it. She told me I deserved to have my own life free from their drama. Hearing her say that felt like a huge burden was lifted from me. For the first time, I didn't feel like the bad guy. I decided then and there to stick to my decision. I wasn't going to let them pressure me into giving in. I started focusing on myself again, tuning out the noise from my family. It wasn't easy, and there were still times I felt guilty, but deep down, I knew I was making the right choice. Ben didn't reach out again after that, which I was perfectly fine with. I figured he would just move on to someone else who would give him what he wanted. As for my mom, I knew she was upset, but I wasn't going to chase her approval anymore. I had spent too many years trying to earn it, and it was never enough. It was tough to accept that sometimes family doesn't turn out the way you expect, but ultimately, I had to prioritize myself. I wasn't going to be a doormat just because we shared DNA. Family should be about mutual support, not about taking advantage of someone's kindness. If standing up for myself meant losing people who never truly valued me in the first place, then maybe it wasn't such a loss after all. After everything that happened with Ben, my mom, and the rest of the family treating me like the villain, things went quiet. It was almost unsettling because for a few weeks, there were no calls, no texts, and no guilt-trippy social media posts. It felt unusually calm, and I thought maybe, just maybe, they had finally accepted my decision. But, of course, I should have known better. This family doesn't give up that easily. One day, after work, I pulled into my driveway and saw a car parked on the street. It took me a moment to recognize it, but then I realized it was Ben's car. My stomach sank. I wasn't expecting any visitors and definitely didn't want to deal with him face to face. But there he was, leaning against his car like he had all the time in the world, just waiting. I thought about driving away and pretending I hadn't seen him, but that felt like running away. So I took a deep breath, parked, and got out of the car. The whole time, I was bracing myself for whatever excuse or sob story he had planned, but instead, he just stood there, staring at me as if I were a stranger. It was incredibly awkward. Finally, he broke the silence and said, "We need to talk." I could tell he was trying to sound calm, but his voice had a sharp edge that made me uneasy. I crossed my arms and said, "Look, if you're here to try and change my mind, it's not going to happen." He shook his head, and for a moment, I thought maybe he was going to back off. But then he launched into a long speech about how desperate things had become for him and his family. He said they'd been living in a motel and couldn't afford it for much longer. He looked so serious, like he expected me to just give in and say, "Okay, fine, come stay with me." But I didn't. I stood firm and told him again that I wasn't comfortable with him moving in, and that I wasn't going to change my mind. That's when his expression shifted. It went from sad and desperate to outright angry. Really angry. He started pacing back and forth, his fists clenched. "You don't get it," he snapped. "We have nowhere else to go, and you have this huge house all to yourself. How can you be so selfish?" My face burned with anger, but I kept my voice steady. "Ben, this isn't about the space. It's about what you put me through when we were kids, and the fact that you still refuse to take responsibility for it. You can't just waltz in and expect everything to be fine." I thought maybe he'd calm down and understand that I wasn't going to give in, but instead, he doubled down. "You know what your problem is?" he shot back. "You're stuck in the past. People grow up, they move on, but you're holding on to grudges, like we're still kids. I've got a family to think about, and you're acting like a spoiled brat." Hearing that made my heart race, and my hands start shaking. I wanted to scream at him, to say everything I had been holding back for years, but I knew that wouldn't fix anything. So I looked him straight in the eye and said, "This isn't about holding a grudge. It's about protecting myself. You don't get to tell me how to feel after everything you did." He paused for a second, and I thought maybe that would be the end of it. But instead, he just laughed. This bitter, mocking laugh. "Fine," he said. "You want to act all high and mighty. Go ahead. But don't come crying to me when you need help someday. Family is supposed to be there for each other." Then he stormed off, got into his car, and drove away. I stood in the driveway, feeling a mix of anger and relief. Part of me was glad he was gone, but another part of me was furious that he had the nerve to try and guilt-trip me again, like I was the one in the wrong for setting boundaries. The next few days were quiet again, and I thought maybe he'd finally gotten the message. But then, a week later, I came home to a horrible surprise. Someone had egged my front door. It was a mess, eggshells and yolk splattered all over the place. My first thought was that it had to be Ben or one of his friends. Who else would do something like that? I felt this wave of frustration hit me. It was like I couldn't escape his anger, even when he wasn't physically around. I took pictures of the damage, cleaned it up, and immediately called the police to file a report. I knew it probably wouldn't lead anywhere, but I wanted something on record in case things got worse. After that, I decided to install security cameras around my house. I wasn't taking any chances. If Ben or anyone else tried something again, I wanted proof. I had had enough of feeling like I was the one in the wrong when all I was doing was protecting my space and my peace of mind. Once the cameras were set up, I felt a little more at ease, but the tension still hung in the air. I kept checking my phone, half expecting another wave of guilt trip messages or an accidental run-in with Ben. But instead, there was silence. Then, out of the blue, I got a call from my mom. She hadn't spoken to me since the last time she came over, so I figured this would be another lecture. I thought about ignoring it, but I decided to hear her out. Maybe she would finally understand. Well, I was wrong. The moment I answered, she jumped right into it. "I heard what happened with Ben. You can't keep turning your back on family like this," she said, not even acknowledging my side of things. I told her about the egging, but instead of being concerned, she dismissed it. "Oh, don't be dramatic," she said. "It was probably just some kids messing around." I couldn't believe it. She was defending him even when I had proof of his escalating behavior. "Mom, I know it was him. Who else would do this?" I said, trying to stay calm. She sighed and said, "You've made your choice. I hope you don't regret it when you're the one who needs help someday." That was the moment I realized that no matter how many times I tried to explain myself, she would never see things from my perspective. Ben was always going to be her priority, and nothing would change that. I told her, "If that's how you feel, then maybe it's better if we don't talk for a while." She didn't argue. She just said, "Fine," and hung up. I felt this huge mix of emotions, anger, sadness, but also this strange sense of relief. It was like I had finally accepted that I wasn't going to get the support I had been hoping for from her or anyone else in that part of the family. Since then, things have been quiet. I haven't heard from Ben, and my mom has stayed out of my life. I still get the occasional message from extended family, but I've learned to ignore it. I've focused on building my life on my own terms, without needing their approval or validation. The cameras have given me peace of mind, and I'm making my house feel more like my own safe space again. I've come to terms with the fact that sometimes family isn't about the people you share blood with. It's about the people who genuinely care for you, who don't try to manipulate or guilt-trip you into doing things you're not comfortable with. At the end of the day, I don't regret my decision. It's hard and lonely sometimes, but I know I did the right thing by standing my ground. I don't owe anyone my peace, not even family. And if that means some doors are permanently closed, then so be it. I'd rather be alone than surrounded by people who don't respect my boundaries.